You're listening to the second annual Sovereign Radio podcast. I'm your host, Chango Unchained, and I'm here with Henry DeValence, who is the founder of Penumbra. Welcome to the show.
Great to meet you.
Yeah. Well, we have met before, and we did do a primer on Penumbra more than a year ago on my podcast called Interchain FM. So if you haven't watched Interchain FM with Henry on it before, I recommend that you do to get the download about Penumbra. And we're going to talk to Henry today about the progression he's made since then and about mainnet launch.
Yeah. So the first phase of the Penumbra mainnet happened last week.
Congratulations.
So it'll be exciting to see how it goes. It's been a pretty wild journey. It's actually nearly three years in the making. So with a lot of other crypto projects, right? Like I guess the meta is like, oh, you just kind of make something that kind of half works and then yeet it out and then maybe try to fix it like later. And sure, other people do that. But for us, I guess because of this sort of point and principle of like, for something that is privacy focused, for something that we want it to be really truly decentralized, like right out the gate, you can't do like the ETH rollup thing where you have training wheels and it's actually centralized or whatever. You have to actually build a kind of complete end-to-end thing. And that definitely took us a little while, but we did it and now it's out there.
Yeah, and it's different because Penumbra started off as a monolithic app chain, so there needs to be a lot more method to the madness than simply eating out a roll-up with the centralized sequencer.
Yeah.
Right. A lot more intentionality behind it and thought that goes into the mechanism and the tokenomics. So speaking of tokenomics, recent news is that people claimed their airdrop and they were able to stake, and you now have a Genesis set and it's running mainnet. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the Genesis launch was orchestrated by Radiant Commons, which is a Penumbra ecosystem nonprofit. And what they did when they made the Genesis, so the airdrop claim, was they actually allowed members of the community to select what validators would be in the Genesis set. So a lot of the time with like Cosmos launches, there's this whole thing of like, you know, weird games about like what validators are there. For Penumbra, we had been running open, public, totally non-incentivized testnets for about 3 years at this point. We actually did our first testnet, like basically the first time that we could make a transaction and it do something. We just like yeeted it out, called it a testnet. And I think we went through like 78 or 79 different testnets and just like exploded one after another. But it was a really valuable thing because we're sort of, first of all, we're doing the ethos of like build in public and let people play with it. But as a result of that, there's kind of like, okay, here are these validators that are participating in this network. And those validators who are participating on the testnet can kind of like transition to participation in mainnet by getting airdrop claimers to paste in their validator address as part of the Genesis. And so the thing that Radiant designed basically allowed the community to do a decentralized selection process for the initial validator set by seeing like, okay, of the community distribution, we're going to allow the community to vote on who is going to be part of this validator set.
Right. That is a really interesting methodology because it was kind of like when I was claiming my airdrop, it was kind of like an Easter egg hunt for the validator addresses. And so you either were able to obtain it by selecting the validator of your choice, and if you had a connection with them, you had to ask them for the address. Or in my case, I just kind of cheated and I asked you for the list, and then out of that list selected my favorite validator, which is shout out to Pikachu,
Yeah.
and then put in the validator address therein.
So this is actually an interesting point because it's an interesting example of what I think of as like creating a vacuum intentionally. And when Radiant was making the airdrop site, they didn't want to put a list because then that's sort of predetermining or prejudging. And instead, by having it be this just a plain text box, it creates a space for the community to have things that kind of emerge from the soil, right? Like rather than having this top-down, like, oh, we're going to centrally plan out this whole thing, it's like, let's get like the nice like soil and put the fertilizer on and water it and then like see what sprouts come out of that. And that's also been the way that the genesis has happened since then. None of the sort of, Penumbra Labs or Radiant Commons are not running any infrastructure very deliberately.
Yes.
And so there's no official RPC or official front end. And what that does is it intentionally sort of creates this space for community efforts to kind of start to grow. And at the very beginning, that is like this super chaotic, like, frustrating process. And so like, sorry for that. But in the long term, I think it is going to create something that's a lot healthier and more sustainable because instead of sort of relying on this like one central party. I think if you look at blockchains generally, even when a team is trying very hard to make sure that something is practically decentralized, the inertia of like, oh, this is the org where all the devs are, it's always so convenient. It's just, oh, well, we'll just add one thing in there and we'll add one thing in there. And then you end up with having one org that like accidentally, has too much power. Yeah. And so this kind of like intentional, like creating vacuums, creating space for things to grow and emerge is about trying to make sure that the decentralization isn't just this like abstract ideal or a meme, but it's actually something real about how the network is formed.
Yeah, absolutely. I respect that completely. That was more aligned with the, I would say even, pre-2020 ethos, where there was a lot more effort being invested in decentralized networks because we know that this thing needs to be censorship resistant in case that nation states or institutions try to take over a network, like the phase that we are in now. And especially for a privacy network, it's so important, right? Because you're protecting the sovereignty, the financial sovereignty of your users. And yeah, that was the idea and the intent behind. When we were launching the Cosmos Network, that was sort of the thing as well, right? Kind of changed over time, but right? There needs to be a shepherd, a gardener of sorts. That's kind of the BDFL, and you're watering and pruning the plants and then harvesting the weeds from the chaff, right? Over time. So you have your work cut out. Your work ahead of you for the next 5 years. You've just started. This is the
we'll
beginning.
See how it goes.
Yes. Very excited
exciting
for you. Okay, so we're at Modular Summit now, and you've given a talk, and your talk is about dark rollups.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so this is fun. It's kind of a nice little like side quest, right? Rather than giving a talk of like, oh, I'm going to go and like shill Penumbra, I gave a talk that is kind of trying to point people who are working on rollups to broaden their design horizons. And one of the insights there is that, even though Penumbra, right, it's been 3 years in the making. When we started working on it, like Celestia didn't even exist.
Well, it was Lazy Ledger back then.
Sure. But if you look at how the design of a shielded chain works and you sort of think about it, you can start reconceptualizing some of these design elements using the language of rollups and get some interesting conceptual insight there. And so I gave a talk last year at the Modular Summit 2 about shielded transactions or rollups. And the idea there is, when you think about how are you going to build privacy on chain, how does a shielded chain work? At a very high level, the way that you get privacy on chain is you take the user data and you move it off the chain onto the end user device so that people have like local data. And then the transaction that a user makes is going to send proofs back to the network that says like, oh, I updated my state correctly. And in that sense, you can think of like each individual shielded transaction as being like that user's own little personal rollup that just has their own account state, because nobody else like has access to that info. But in the same way that, like a rollup will like settle to an L1, you can think of a transaction on a shielded chain as having some user data that only exists on their computer that's being like settled to this base layer.
Ooh, I like that a lot more, the notion that a rollup should be basically a personalized node for an individual making transactions, rather than this monolithic rollup as a service for a whole bunch of different people where everyone's transactions are all public for one entity to see.
And actually built that, one of the reason that Penumbra took a while to actually get to the state where it's ready to go is when you think about what does privacy mean practically, it turns out so much of blockchain infrastructure implicitly depends on this idea that there's this like big database in the sky and we can just query it. But when we think about a privacy-oriented chain, like there's no RPC that you can just say like, hey, what's my account balance? That information is not known by design. And so we actually have had to build a whole client stack where we're orienting around like local first data architecture. The browser wallet for Penumbra, Prax, it has effectively an ultralight node that like runs in the browser and like it's like a personal indexer for just your account.
And it's just asking for proofs and then we're
right. And so that we've really had to realize this kind of idea of decentralization and personal ownership over your personal data. We've had to build a lot of the software stack around that kind of local first paradigm.
Mm-hmm. That harkens back to Bitcoin SPVs, right? I think we've, as a space, have gone so far off from that because we've taken the convenient route, right? RPCs are convenient. Someone else verifying transactions is easier for the end user, right? They don't have to think about it. But yeah, the SPV and the light proofs concept is where we should be going back to. And I really appreciate that.
One of the kind of jokes that we have internally is like Penumbra is like the way blockchain should have been.
Yeah.
Or like Penumbra is built different, right? and it's like, there's the joke meaning, but there's also a literal meaning, right? Which is like we literally went and like reimagined how should you build a blockchain so that it is private and so that users are in control of their data. And to take it to another example in our current kind of decentralization chaos period. When we made the Penumbra front-end code, we didn't want it to be that there's like the front end, and then that is then this like choke point or like point of control for users. So we wanted to make it instead where you can have many, many different third-party front ends that all do different things, and they all connect to a user's wallet, which is like their local RPC. And the front-end code, we actually built it so that it can be a completely static site with like no server-side backend, and it's bundled into the full node. So every single Penumbra RPC endpoint also will serve you a static copy of a Penumbra frontend. And so it's impossible to have any kind of like choke point over that network, because all someone has to do is like run a full node. We have like you can run one terminal command and it'll spin up a full node and it'll do like auto HTTPS and it'll serve RPC and it'll serve a front end. And by making the software really easy to run, obviously even if you make it easier to run in a terminal, that's still not enough for everyone. But by reducing the friction and the effort required to run a node, practically speaking, we can greatly increase decentralization. And right now on the Penumbra forums, there's a forum thread with various community members posting like, here's an RPC that I spun up. And so there's this whole collection of like community-oriented RPCs and front ends. And for Penumbra Labs, who are making Prax, which is the browser wallet, we're going to be able to like look and say, what are the efforts that have emerged from the community? And then we can sort of put in like, okay, here's a list of like suggested RPCs or front ends. So that in the user flow, we don't want forever all the users to have to go on the adventure through the forums to find a front end or an RPC. But by having an initial period where there's kind of this forced vacuum, there's not something that is coming in and imposing, we can like see what efforts are sprouting out of this soil, and then like try to sort of nurture or grow towards those.
Excellent. So in the event of a sort of black swan or some catastrophic, apocalyptic event, let's say your power grid goes out or whatever, but somehow you still have access to internet, or maybe you're able to access Starlink, maybe you have like a solar device, a solar power device or whatever, you can still talk to and utilize Penumbra throughout the stack in that way.
So you still have all of your data locally. And
right.
One of the things that's kind of interesting is like, for a lot of these sort of resilience or issues of resilience in software, it's useful when you're designing it to think about this like very strong adversary model.
Yes.
But when you do that, if you build for that stronger adversary, you actually end up being secure against a lot of like lesser problems. Right. And so, maybe it's not that like there's been the sort of local apocalypse and all the power is out, but like maybe you're just on an airplane and the Wi-Fi is shitty.
Right.
And you want to still be able to see your transaction data. Like, having designed it to be local first, it's beneficial in that case too. It's kind of like the way that when people are talking about urban design, a lot of like accessibility features for like, putting the curb cuts at the street corners so that people in a wheelchair can like go around on the sidewalk. Like, that's also helpful when I'm moving a bicycle around.
Yeah.
Right? And so you end up, if you try to build it right, you just end up with something that's better. That's kind of...
Exactly. Well, I'm so excited that Penumbra has finally launched, and I'm looking forward to being able to use the blockchain with privacy built in first. I'm very happy that there's a lot more of these popping up in Cosmos as well. So yeah, thank you for coming on, and I'd love to see the progression of Penumbra.
It'll be great.
Yeah.
I think probably at some point in the next few weeks, depending on how things are going with the network, we'll see some governance proposals to enable more features, enable IBC, and at that point, people will be able to just use the network freely. It'll be great.
Amazing. And if you haven't seen his talk yet, please do watch the Modular Summit talk.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on.